My father slid a thick contract across the Christmas table and said, "Lydia needs $5 million. My parents had not spoken to me in 20 years. 3 days after a national television segment showed the company I had built and put its value near $50 million, my mother called to say they were proud of me. Now my father's hand rested beside a silver pen, waiting for my signature as though the missing 2 decades were nothing more than a late delivery. The paper rasped over the old oak table. Burned butter hung in the air from the kitchen, the same bitter edge beneath the cinnamon and roasted pecans I remembered from childhood. A spoon had slipped into the berry sauce beside Lydia's plate, and a dark red stain spread through the white napkin beneath it. Near the kitchen doorway sat a sealed dessert box with a small internal label on one corner. R3. 6 months later, I could still remember the sound of that contract sliding toward me more clearly than any greeting I received that night. Before I tell you how that Christmas dinner ended, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening. Stay with me, because that contract was only the first lie on the table. And please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happened next. I kept both hands in my lap and looked at the first page without touching it. "You called me home for an investment?" I asked. Dad leaned back in the chair he had occupied at every family dinner of my childhood. "I called you home because we're family, Audrey. The investment is part of helping your sister." Mom reached for the serving bowl and gave me the smile she used whenever company came over. "Have some potatoes, Audie," Elaine said. "I made them the way you liked them, with the browned butter on top." No one had called me Audie since I was 18. The name landed between us like a place setting brought down from the attic. "I'm fine," I said. "You barely touched dinner." My mother spooned potatoes onto my plate anyway. "Mrs. Keller across the street saw your television interview. She called before the segment was even over. Everyone around here is so proud of you." The mantel behind her held 9 framed photographs. Lydia appeared in every one. I was visible in a single picture from elementary school, half blocked by a Christmas wreath. Lydia folded her hands beside her wine glass. At 34, my younger sister had learned how to hold a room without raising her voice. Her face had been on grocery displays, morning television, and the side of delivery trucks under the Bennett Hearth logo. "We've always followed what you were doing," she said. "We just didn't know if you wanted us to reach out." My thumb pressed against the smooth edge of my hotel keycard inside my pocket. "You found a way when you needed $5 million. Dad's fork struck his plate. "That's enough." "No, Richard," Mom said softly. "Let her get it out. She's carried this for a long time." I turned the contract slightly so I could see the footer. 48 pages, plus schedules and attachments. "Why wasn't this sent to Dana?" I asked. Dad's eyes moved to mine. "Who is Dana?" "My attorney. I gave Lydia her contact information yesterday." Lydia lifted one shoulder. "This wasn't supposed to be some hostile corporate deal. We thought we could talk as sisters first." "Then why did your email say the agreement had to be signed tonight?" I asked. A pause followed, small but clean. The heating vent clicked beneath the window, and outside, tires hissed over wet snow on the street. Dad picked up the silver pen and set it on top of the contract. "Families don't need lawyers to help each other." "Companies do," I said, "and True Table will not sign anything tonight." Mom's fingers stopped against the rim of the serving bowl. "You're staying here, aren't you?" "I have a room at the Lakeview." "On Christmas?" Elaine asked. I drove myself too. Lydia looked toward Dad, then back at me. "You came here expecting a fight." "I came here expecting paperwork," I said. So far, I was right. Dad opened the contract to a marked section. Bennett Hearth had a problem with one supplier, that's all. A trace amount of peanut protein was found in a limited run of holiday products, and we issued a voluntary recall. "I read the notice," I said. "It named 6 production lots. The same ingredient went into all 6, Lydia said quickly. "Our supplier changed something without telling us." "Which ingredient?" I asked. Her gaze shifted toward the contract. "The investigation is still open." Dad tapped the page. "The bank wants additional reserves until this is resolved. Part of the $5 million covers the recall fund. Part keeps payroll running. And part satisfies the lender so we can operate through the review." The number was plausible for a regional food company facing a recall and a nervous bank. That made the rest of the agreement more dangerous, not less. Then I reached the ownership section. This says TrueTable acquires the affected production facility, I said. A temporary transfer, Lydia replied. Your team would bring in its safety systems, the retailers would calm down, and we could preserve the jobs. How many employees? I asked. 212, Dad said. People with mortgages, kids in college, families who have worked for us for years. Mom drew a slow breath through her nose. This town has already lost the paper mill and half the machine shops. Bennett Hearth is one of the few places still hiring. You could protect all of that. I turned another page. TrueTable also grants Bennett Hearth the right to use our safety seal. Only during the transition, Lydia said. And we certify that our systems have a common origin. They do, my sister said. We learned in the same kitchen. 20 years earlier, I had drawn blue triangles on production cards, separated utensils by color, and fastened blue silicone bands to racks used for allergen-controlled orders. Lydia had called my charts obsessive. Now she wanted my signature under a statement that made our systems relatives. I looked toward the sealed dessert box by the kitchen. The label was printed in black on white stock. R3. Lydia noticed where my attention had gone and moved her elbow, blocking part of my view. What does R3 mean? I asked. It's a routing code, Lydia said. Nothing related to this. Dad pushed the pen closer. Audrey, no one is asking you to do this blind. You can bring your people in tomorrow. But we need the commitment tonight so the bank knows the money is coming. Before my attorney reviews the schedules? The schedules are standard, he said. Then you won't mind Dana reading them. His palm flattened on the table. The silver pen rolled an inch and stopped against the water glass. I read the paragraph beneath the transfer terms twice. TrueTable would assume certain commercial claims connected to products distributed after the effective date, but another section reached backward through warranties, shared procedures, and prior operational knowledge. The words were broad enough to create arguments no careful buyer would volunteer to inherit. What is a legacy process acknowledgement? I asked. Lydia answered before Dad could. It confirms that the safety methods used by both companies came from the same family process. Which process? The original separation system, she said. The one you told the local paper you created after I left? Her mouth tightened. This is not the time to fight over an old interview. I'm asking about the document you want me to sign tonight. Dad's voice dropped. The bank needs confidence in the continuity of the system. Continuity means history, I said. You want TrueTable to say Bennett Hearth's current controls grew out of a process I helped design. That is true, Mom said. You were always good with those little labels and charts. For 20 years, they had said I ignored the rules and nearly killed a child. Now, my old system was valuable enough to place inside a multi-million-dollar contract. Lydia leaned forward. You built a company worth $50 million. I stayed here. I kept this business alive through recessions, retailer pressure, rising costs, and every staffing mess you can imagine. I'm not asking you to hand me a check because I'm your sister. I'm asking you to invest in a real company with real workers. Then send the full deal to my board, I said. We don't have weeks, she replied. You had time to prepare 48 pages. Mom's spoon struck the bowl. For crying out loud, Audrey, must everything become a trial with you? Your sister is trying to save people's jobs. No, I said. She's asking my company to buy a plant under investigation, lend its safety seal, accept commercial claims, and sign a statement about a process from 20 years ago. Those are not the same thing. Elaine's eyes filled, but no tears fell. She had always been skilled at stopping one step before the performance became obvious. You would let the past destroy 200 families? She asked. I looked at the contract again, then at the dessert box marked R3. Something had been sitting in plain sight all evening, and the harder they pushed me to sign, the less I believed the supplier's story. You said the contamination came from one ingredient. I told Lydia. You also said the investigation is open. Yet this agreement is written as if TrueTable already knows enough to certify the system. Lydia's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Our consultants drafted it. Then your consultants can speak to Dana. Dad stood. His chair legs scraped the floor, the sound sharp enough to make Mom flinch. I did not bring my daughter home to be cross-examined at my own table. You didn't bring your daughter home, I said. I closed the contract. The leather folder I had kept beside my chair came up onto the table, and the brass zipper sounded too loud in the sudden quiet. You invited my money. Mom stared at the folder. Lydia's practiced calm slipped for less than a second, but I caught it in the way her shoulders drew back. I removed a thin packet of copies and slid it across the oak. Dad reached for it, but Elaine got there first. The top page was a faded carbon copy from December of 2005. Most of the writing had softened to gray, though the production lines were still readable. Beside the relabeling authorization sat Lydia's initials. The recorded time had been written over, the second set of numbers darker than the rest. Mom did not look at Lydia. She looked at the bottom right corner, where her own handwriting appeared beside the revised shift entry. The color left her knuckles as she gripped the page. Dad took it from her. Where did you get this? That isn't the question you should be asking, I said. Lydia pushed back from the table. That paper is 20 years old. You can't possibly know what it means. I know your initials. I was 14. And I was 18 when you let everyone say I did it. Mom pressed both hands against the tablecloth. Audrey, please, there are things about that night you never understood. Then explain the change time. No one answered. Dad searched the remaining pages, but I had brought no source names, original documents, or full timeline. This is a misunderstanding, he said. We can explain. Do it through Dana, I said. I stood and put on my coat. Dad moved between me and the front hall, not close enough to touch me, but close enough to make the old message clear. Sit down. Listen. Accept the family version before leaving. You are not walking out after dropping this on the table, Richard said. You will sit down and hear the whole story. My attorney has the contract and the same copies you're holding, I said. If I don't call her by 9:30, she follows the instructions I gave her. Mom's voice dropped. What instructions? The kind people give when they're meeting relatives who refuse to send documents to counsel. Dad stepped aside, but his jaw stayed locked. At the front door, Lydia came after me carrying the sealed dessert box. Take this, she said. You didn't eat anything. The white label with R3 sat beneath a strip of clear tape. I accepted the box by its edges and slipped it into the empty insulated bag I kept in my car for food samples and groceries. Thank you, I said. Her gaze dropped to the bag. It's just cake, Audrey. Then there's nothing to worry about. Cold air struck my cheeks outside. Gray snow lined the driveway, and Christmas lights blinked across the neighboring porches. I locked myself in the car, set the sealed box on the passenger side floor, and waited until warm air reached my hands. Then I texted Nora. I showed them the carbon copy. Elaine recognized it before Richard did. The reply arrived before I started the engine. That carbon copy is not the only record your mother changed, Nora wrote. Nora's message stayed on my screen while the car warmed around me. That carbon copy is not the only record your mother changed. I read it 3 times, then called her. Nora answered on the second ring. Traffic hummed faintly behind her, followed by the clicking sound of a turn signal. Are you away from the house? She asked. I'm in my car. Doors locked? Yes. A breath passed through the phone. Good. Don't go back inside tonight. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. What else did Elaine change? Not over the phone, Nora said. You need to remember how it started first, not the story they gave the insurance company. What actually happened in that kitchen? I had spent 20 years trying not to remember that night in order. Memory rarely cooperates with instructions. It saves the smell of flour dust inside a winter coat, the scrape of a metal rack across tile, the pressure of a marker between 2 fingers. It buries the words that matter until something small digs them up again. For me, it was the blue, silicone band around a baking rack. In December of 2005, Bennett's Bakery was still one storefront, with an apartment above it and a production room added behind the original kitchen. Dad had not yet built the factory. Mom kept payroll in a locking metal drawer beneath the register, the finner, the fiverd, the prep table when she bothered to do it at all. I was 18 and halfway through an application for a food science scholarship. My project was a low-cost separation system for bakeries that could not afford dedicated rooms for allergen-controlled products. Blue silicone bands went around the handles of approved racks, blue triangles appeared on production cards. Utensils with matching grips stayed in a separate cabinet, and nothing left the ordinary line for the controlled one once mixing began. The idea was simple enough for a tired employee to follow during a crowded shift. That mattered more than making it impressive. Dad liked the increase in orders. He liked telling school groups and church committees that his oldest daughter had designed a safer process. He did not like the cost. "You're asking people to wash the same bowl twice," Richard said one afternoon, studying my time calculations. "That adds labor. It prevents residue from moving between batches," I replied. "The bowl looks clean after the first cycle." "Looking clean and testing clean aren't the same thing." His pencil tapped against my chart. "You can't run a business as if every crumb is a catastrophe." I took the chart back before the pencil left another dent. For the wrong person, one crumb can be. Lydia sat on a flower bin nearby, swinging one boot above the floor. At 14, she could turn boredom into an accusation. "Audrey thinks everybody is going to die from touching a cookie," she said. "I think labels should mean what they say." Dad gave Lydia a look that made her sit straighter. "Your sister is trying to build something useful." That should have pleased me. Instead, I watched Lydia's boot stop moving. Praise in our house never landed on one child without being taken from the other. The week before Christmas, the bakery received an order for a school fundraiser. There were iced sugar cookies, chocolate bars, cinnamon cakes, and 4 dozen nut-free raspberry squares for families who had requested them in advance. The order was worth more than we usually made in 2 days. By late afternoon, every surface held cooling pans or labeled boxes. The mixer groaned against thick dough, the exhaust fan rattled above the ovens, and wet mittens dripped onto the rubber mat by the back door. I had a scholarship presentation at the community college that evening. Before leaving, I counted the nut-free trays, checked the blue triangles, and moved the approved racks against the far wall. "We're short one," Lydia said. Her finger ran down the order sheet. I counted again. 5 trays. We needed 6. "The last batch is still cooling," I said. "There isn't another batch." Across the room, Dad was arguing with a delivery driver about a late shipment. Lydia glanced toward him, then lowered her voice. "He told me to finish the school order, so finish the labels and wait for the 6th tray. He said it has to leave by 6, then tell him we're short." Her mouth pulled to one side. "Easy for you to say. He never talks to you like you're stupid." Dad called my name from the front office. I gathered my folder and coat, then pointed to the 5 blue-banded racks. "Nothing else gets that label," I told Lydia. "Not even if the products look the same." She rolled her eyes. "I know how colors work." "Say it." Her cheeks flushed. "Only the blue racks." I left through the stockroom to finish the weekly count before my teacher picked me up. What happened in the prep room during those next few minutes came to me later in pieces. Some came from Nora. Some came from records. The last piece came from Lydia herself, although she waited many years before giving it to me. A regular batch of raspberry squares sat on an unmarked rack near the cooling fans. They looked identical after icing. The filling had been made with equipment used earlier that day for peanut butter bars. Lydia had one incomplete order: a father who measured mistakes in decibels, and a blue band she could slide from one handle to another. She told herself it was one tray. She told herself the equipment had been wiped down. Most of all, she told herself nothing would happen. By the time I left for my presentation, the fundraiser boxes were stacked by the loading door. Dad barely looked up when I called goodbye. The phone rang at the bakery less than an hour later. I was standing beside a poster board in a classroom when my teacher, Mrs. Collins, entered and spoke quietly to the coordinator. Both women looked toward me. "There's been an emergency at the school fundraiser," Mrs. Collins said. "Your father wants you back at the bakery." The ride took 12 minutes. I remember that because I counted every one of them while Mrs. Collins drove through slushy streets with both hands fixed at 10 and 2. An ambulance was leaving the school when we passed. At the bakery, the front door had been locked, even though the lights were on. Nora let me in from the side entrance. Her apron was dusted with flour, and the skin around her mouth had gone tight. "A boy had a reaction," she said. "They took him to the hospital." "What did he eat?" Nora pointed toward an open fundraiser box on the counter. One raspberry square remained inside. Mom stood behind the register with a telephone pressed to her ear, repeating that the family would cooperate fully. Dad paced near the office, telling everyone not to speak to reporters, parents, teachers, or anyone from the school. Lydia sat on a stool by the sink. She had folded herself inward, elbows pressed against her ribs. A blue silicone band lay on the floor near her shoe. I picked up the empty box sleeve and read the handwritten production mark. It did not match the controlled batch. The approved raspberry squares had been mixed before noon. This tray carried the mark from the regular afternoon line. "Where did this come from?" I asked. Nobody answered. I walked to the prep room and checked the rack positions. One blue rack stood empty where I had left it. An unmarked rack beside the cooling fan held crumbs and pink icing smears. "Dad," I called, "this wasn't from the nut-free batch." Richard came through the doorway and shut it behind him. "You don't know that. The production mark is wrong. We don't know what else that child ate." The tray came from the ordinary line. Mom ended her call and began collecting every production card from the counter. "Audrey, lower your voice. Where are you taking those?" "I'm putting the records somewhere safe." "Then leave them in order." Elaine stacked the cards against her chest. "This is not the time for you to take control." It was the first moment I understood that they were already thinking beyond the hospital. Not about what the child needed, about what the bakery needed. Dad ordered Nora to clean the prep area and told the rest of us to stay inside. "No one discusses ingredients, racks, or procedures with anybody," he said. "Everything goes through me." Lydia rose from the stool and followed Mom toward the office. Her steps were uneven, one heel catching against the tile. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. Elaine glanced at me before pulling Lydia through the office door. The latch did not close completely. I stood beside the filing cabinet, close enough to hear my sister's broken sentences through the narrow gap. "I only moved one tray," Lydia said. Mom answered too quietly for me to catch the words. "I thought it was the same," Lydia continued. "It looked exactly the same." A chair scraped inside. Then Dad's voice cut through. "How many people saw you?" "I don't know." "Did Audrey?" "No." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to step closer. "We could lose the insurance," Dad said. "If they decide the label was changed on purpose, they can deny the claim." "She's 14, Mom whispered. "That does not make the bakery less liable. What if we say the procedure wasn't followed?" "By whom?" Another silence settled behind the door. Then my mother spoke. "Audrey's name is on the system." The muscles across my shoulders drew tight. "She's 18, Elaine continued. "She was supervising the order. People already know she created the process." "She wasn't in the room," Lydia said. Mom's answer came fast. "You don't remember exactly where she was." "I do remember." "You're frightened," Elaine said. "Frightened people confuse things." Dad began pacing. I knew the rhythm of his shoes against the office floor. 3 steps toward the window, 3 steps back. "Audrey can recover from this," Mom said. "She has options. Lydia doesn't." Those words stayed cleaner in my memory than anything else from that night. Audrey can recover from this. As if my future were a spare tray they could pull from the ordinary line. The office door opened. Mom stepped out holding the production cards, and the surprise on her face lasted only a fraction of a second. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough." Dad appeared behind her. "Go upstairs." "No." His gaze flattened. "This is not a discussion." The tray was changed. Lydia just said she moved it. Lydia stood near the desk, wiping both palms against her jeans. "Tell him," I said. "Tell Dad what you told Mom." Her eyes flicked between us. "Lydia," I said again. "Whose tray was it?" She swallowed. "I don't remember. You remembered 30 seconds ago." Mom moved between us. "Stop attacking your sister. A boy is in the hospital." "And screaming at Lydia will not help him," Elaine replied. Dad pointed toward the stairs. "Upstairs. Now." I did not go. By the next afternoon, they had prepared a statement. The paper said I had failed to maintain separation between the regular and controlled production areas. It said I had authorized the relabeling of a tray after noticing the shortage. It described the mistake as an isolated lapse during an unusually busy holiday shift. Dad set the statement in front of me at the kitchen table. "If you sign, we handle this privately," Richard said. "The insurance company pays the medical claim, the bakery survives, and you stay here." Mom sat beside him with her hands folded. We'll help you find another scholarship next year. My presentation was last night. There will be others, Elaine said. What happens to Lydia? Dad's expression did not change. Your sister is a minor. That was not my question. Lydia stood near the refrigerator, staring at a magnet shaped like a snowman. I turned toward her. Say what you did. Her lips parted, but Mom spoke first. She already told you she doesn't remember clearly. She moved the tray. You cannot prove that, Dad said. The sentence was so calm that I stopped looking at Lydia. There it was, not panic, not confusion, a decision. If I sign this, you keep me here because I'm useful, I said. If I refuse, you tell everyone I did it anyway. Dad pushed the pen toward me. If you walk away from this table, you walk away from this family. Mom reached across and touched my wrist. Don't throw away your whole life over one statement. I moved my hand before her fingers could close around it. It isn't my statement. Richard stood. Then pack your things. I carried one suitcase down the stairs that night. Mrs. Collins picked me up at the corner because Dad would not allow her into the driveway. For 6 weeks, I slept in her sewing room beneath a shelf of fabric boxes and worked mornings at a diner before finishing school. The scholarship disappeared. The local paper printed the bakery's version. A college withdrew its early offer after someone mailed them the article. I enrolled at community college the following fall, took night classes, and washed equipment in an industrial kitchen where nobody cared whose daughter I had been. Years later, my first food company failed because I trusted a distributor who promised more than he could deliver. I sold my car, laid off 4 people, and started again from a borrowed office with a folding table. True Table did not grow from revenge. It grew from the sentence my father had used for years. A trace amount does not matter. I built a company around proving that it did. Nora's voice brought me back to the cold car outside my parents' house. I kept the carbon copy because Richard was getting ready to blame me next, she said. Your mother changed the time after the original left the kitchen. Where's the version they gave the insurer? I never had it, Nora replied. But the insurance company did. And the law office that handled the settlement should have received a copy. Snowmelt ticked against the underside of my car as I stared through the windshield at the house. Do you know which law office? I asked. I know where the old claim files were sent when the attorney retired, Nora said. And if those records still exist, the official version will not match the page you put on that table. Dana Mercer read the contract twice before she spoke. We sat in a small conference room at her office the morning after Christmas, with gray snow pressed against the windows and the leather binder open between us. My father's silver pen was still clipped inside the cover. I had forgotten to remove it when I left the house. This agreement cannot erase what Bennett Hearth did before a sale, Dana said. A private contract does not control what injured customers, insurers, lenders, or regulators may pursue. So Richard cannot sign his way out of the past. No, but he can make your company pay for part of the future. And he can create a story in which True Table reviewed the system, accepted it, and continued operating it. Dana turned several pages. The wording about shared process history is especially useful if someone wants to argue that your methods were always part of Bennett Hearth. I looked at the paragraph that had bothered me at dinner. On paper, it sounded almost sentimental. 2 companies, 1 family tradition, continuous safety standards. In practice, it put my name next to theirs before anyone had established what went wrong. I have not assigned a True Table team, I said. No operations staff, no quality staff, no money. You are the only company resource I have used. Keep it that way for now. Dana closed the binder halfway. If you visit the plant, the invitation must say preliminary review only. No certification, no approval, no promise of investment, and no photographs of you beside their safety seal. Lydia already asked me to tour it. Of course she did. Dana slid a yellow legal pad toward me. Put the conditions in writing before you go. By noon, Lydia had accepted every condition in an email that managed to sound both grateful and offended. I would be allowed to observe production areas, ask questions, and review records they chose to provide. Nothing I said or did would count as approval. No company announcement would mention an investment. The email looked clean. The parking lot did not. 2 days after Christmas, old snow had turned gray around the loading docks, and a delivery truck idled beneath a sky, the color of dirty wool. Bennett Hearth occupied a low brick factory at the edge of town, larger than the bakery I remembered but built around the same promise. Warm food, safe families, a local name people trusted. Lydia met me inside the reception area wearing a cream sweater, dark slacks, and the expression she saved for morning television. A young employee stood several feet behind her, with a phone mounted on a stabilizer. "There she is," Lydia said brightly. "My sister finally came home to help us protect the company our parents built." The phone's camera pointed straight at me. "Turn it off," I said. The employee froze. Lydia's smile stayed in place, though a muscle moved near her jaw. "It's only for the internal team. People have been scared since the recall." "Then tell them the truth. I am here for a preliminary review. I have not agreed to invest, certify the plant, or join the company." The young man lowered the phone. Lydia touched his sleeve. "Give us a minute, Caleb." When he left, she folded her arms. 200 people are wondering whether they will have jobs next month. Seeing you here would give them hope. Hope based on a false statement is advertising. You have always known how to make ordinary words sound like charges. And you have always known when a camera was running. For a moment, the polished television face disappeared. Then Lydia picked up a visitor badge and held it out. "We agreed to a preliminary review with no promises. Are we done arguing? We are starting." The production floor was warmer than the front offices, with a steady mechanical hum beneath the hiss of wash hoses and the clatter of metal pans. The place looked clean at first glance. Hairnets, gloves, color-coded signs, blue tape marking controlled zones. A framed slogan hung above the hand-washing station. A label should mean exactly what it says. Those were my words. I had written them across the top of a school presentation when I was 18. Lydia followed my gaze. "It is a good principle. Where did you get it?" "Dad has said that for years." A woman pushing a rack passed behind us and gave me a quick look. "We still call the blue setup the Audrey protocol on second shift," she said. Lydia turned. "What did you say, Marcy?" The woman's hands tightened around the rack handle. "I said the audit protocol for second shift." Her shoes squeaked against the floor as she moved away. My sister began explaining a new scanner system, but I had already seen the blue silicone grips on the designated utensils and the triangles printed on the production cards. Some details had changed. The structure had not. They had removed my name from the public story. Yet it still survived in the mouths of employees when management was not listening. Near the mixing area, waist-high bins stood beneath laminated signs marked rework. Each bin held sealed containers of usable filling or dough left from a prior run. The material could be folded into a later batch instead of being discarded, provided the ingredients and allergen category matched. One cart carried the code R3. I stopped beside it. "What does the 3 identify?" "A rework category," Lydia said. "Raspberry-based fillings." "Across which lines?" "Compatible products only." The paper clipped to the cart listed a date, weight, and destination batch. The sanitation section below it had 2 blank signature boxes. "Who released this?" I asked. Lydia leaned closer. "The electronic record will show it." "Then why print the sanitation confirmation?" "Redundancy." "Redundancy only works when both records exist." Richard's voice came from behind me. "You have been here 10 minutes and already found a clerical error." My father wore a white plant coat over his shirt and tie. He had always dressed one level above the people doing the work, even in the old bakery. "2 missing signatures," I said. "Someone entered the cleaning cycle in the system and forgot the paper." "Can I see the electronic entry?" "You are touring, not auditing. You asked my company for $5 million and its safety seal." Richard stepped closer to the cart. "And your sister agreed to let you observe because we have nothing to hide. Do not mistake courtesy for surrender." Lydia moved between us with a folder against her chest. "We have the supplier report ready. That is what Audrey came to review." The conference room above the floor overlooked the packaging line through a wide glass wall. Lydia laid out a preliminary report from Midland Ingredients, a regional supplier that provided starch and fruit stabilizer. One incoming test had shown a trace signal associated with peanut protein. The page was stamped preliminary, and the result had not been confirmed by an outside laboratory. "Where is the sealed retain sample from that shipment?" I asked. Richard sat at the head of the table. "Midland has it. You should have one too." We do, Lydia said. Has it been tested independently? Her fingers aligned the report with the table edge. That is in progress. What about the intake sample collected when the shipment arrived? The original screen was negative, she said. So the ingredient entered the plant as acceptable. 6 finished lots, later tested positive. And now an unconfirmed supplier sample is your public explanation. Richard's chair creaked as he leaned back. You are making it sound more complicated than it is. Contamination usually is. The shift manager, Paul Dwyer, sat near the door with a binder open on his knees. I asked him whether reworked filling ever moved between production lines. Only within the same product family, Paul said. His eyes moved toward Richard before the sentence ended. What does product family mean here? I asked. Paul rubbed one thumb along the binder's spine. Same flavor base, same declared allergens, same handling class. Declared allergens or verified residue? Lydia closed the supplier report. Paul has a floor to run. We are not going to interrogate employees one by one. I asked one question, and he answered it. Paul stood quickly enough for the binder to slide against his knee. I should get back downstairs. After he left, I looked through the glass at the line below. Workers moved in practiced patterns, feeding trays beneath metal guards and stacking finished boxes. From that height, everything appeared orderly. That was the trouble with systems. A clean surface could hide a bad instruction for years. The last stop on Lydia's tour was the cooking room, where stainless steel kettles stood in a row beneath pipes and control panels. They were numbered 1, 2, and 3. Kettle number 3 was larger than the others, with a wheeled pump attached to its base. A worker emptied several containers of raspberry filling into the top. Each bore an R3 label. Rework goes through there? I asked. The young woman holding the last container nodded. It gets brought back to temperature before we add it to the next run. How is the kettle cleaned between allergen classes? She glanced at Lydia. Full wash and verification. Does that happen every time? The container remained against her hip. That is the procedure. How long does a full wash take? About 90 minutes, depending on what ran before. Lydia stepped beside her. Megan, shipping needs help with the afternoon count. The employee set down the container and left without looking back. I checked the production board mounted near the door. Holiday runs had been scheduled nearly back-to-back, some separated by less than an hour. There is not enough time here for the wash she described, I said. The board shows production windows, not every sanitation activity, Lydia replied. Then show me the sanitation log. Richard opened the door to the corridor. The tour is over. The cold outside had sharpened by the time I returned to my hotel. Wind pushed loose snow across the parking lot in thin sheets, and the sealed dessert box from Christmas still sat inside the insulated bag in my trunk. I should have called Dana before touching it. Instead, I photographed the intact tape, wrote the time and location in my notebook, sealed the box inside a clean sample bag, and sent it by courier to True Table's internal laboratory as a reference sample. No independent witness had seen Lydia hand it to me. No documented temperature record covered the hours before I refrigerated it. The label tied it to Bennett Hearth, but not cleanly enough for the kind of fight that was coming. At the time, I told myself I only needed direction. The preliminary result arrived the next afternoon. Peanut protein was present. I read the laboratory note from beginning to end, then called the analyst and made her repeat the limitations aloud. The result showed what was inside the piece of cake we had received. It did not prove where contamination occurred, when it occurred, or whether the sample had remained untouched before it reached the lab. I saved the report and did not release it. That restraint came one step too late. By using my own company's laboratory before disclosing the family conflict to the board, I had given anyone who wanted to attack me a fair question to ask. My phone buzzed while I was still staring at the report. Nora had sent a single message. Stop looking at the supplier. Ask what Richard promised the Hale family about reworked filling. Dana refused to let me call Jonah Hale myself. You have spent 20 years connected to the worst day of his childhood, she said. You do not get to appear in his inbox without warning because you need answers. We were in her office on the first Monday of January, with the Hale settlement file still only a possibility and the preliminary laboratory report locked inside Dana's cabinet. Outside, The morning temperature had fallen below 20 degrees, and salt trucks scraped along the street beneath her window. I wasn't planning to ask him for forgiveness, I said. That is not the only thing he may think you want. Dana contacted the attorney who had helped Marion Hale review the original settlement. The attorney had retired years earlier, but his former firm still represented the family on matters connected to the agreement. It took 4 days before Jonah agreed to meet. His conditions arrived through counsel. No recording unless everyone agreed first. No reporters. No company public relations staff. No money offered to the family. No photographs. No use of Jonah's name in any statement from True Table. I accepted every condition. The meeting took place in a rented conference room inside a law office 2 towns away from Bennett Hearth. Neutral carpet, gray walls, coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. Dana sat beside me with a closed notebook. Across the table were Jonah and his mother, Marion. Jonah was 29, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close at the sides. Nothing about him matched the 9-year-old boy preserved in the newspaper photograph I had seen years earlier, lying beneath a hospital blanket with an oxygen mask over his face. Marion had brought a canvas document bag and placed it on the floor beside her chair. Her coat remained buttoned even after we sat down. No one offered a handshake. Jonah looked at me for several seconds before speaking. You look different from the picture. I was 18 in that picture, I said. You were standing outside the bakery with your father. The photograph had appeared beside an article titled, Local Bakery Responds After Allergy Emergency. Dad stood close to the camera. I was behind him near the door, my face partly turned away. I had just been told not to answer questions, I said. Jonah's fingers rested flat on the table. The story we were given said you ran the allergen line, ignored your own system, and left town before my parents could speak to you. I ran parts of that line, I said. I did not label the tray you ate from. That wasn't my question. Dana did not move beside me. She had warned me not to turn the meeting into a defense statement. But Jonah's question still found the part of me that had rehearsed an answer for 20 years. Why did you wait this long? He asked. You built a company around allergy safety. Your name has been in trade magazines and on television. You had lawyers. You had money. Why didn't you find out what happened to me? The heating unit clicked behind the wall. Marion watched me without blinking. I left because staying meant signing a statement that was not true, I said. For a long time, getting through school and paying rent took everything I had. Later, when I had the means to look back, I told myself the settlement was private and contacting you would reopen something you had put behind you. Jonah leaned away from the table. That was convenient. Yes, I said. His eyebrows lifted slightly, as though he had expected an argument. Leaving was how I survived what my family did, I continued. But silence also meant your family had only their version. I did not ask what that cost you. I should have. I could have told him about the scholarship, the newspaper article, the years spent rebuilding my name. None of it belonged in the space he had opened. Marion unbuttoned her coat but kept it on. Richard Bennett told us you refused to visit the hospital. No one told me I could visit. He said you did not want to face us. I was staying in my teacher's sewing room by then. My parents stopped answering calls that came for me at the bakery. Jonah looked toward his mother. The exchange between them was brief, a glance carrying a conversation I could not hear. What did you know about the kitchen before the fundraiser? He asked. I folded my hands on the table. I knew Dad complained about cleaning time. I knew employees sometimes moved tools because the separate cabinet was inconvenient. I knew production got rushed when large orders came in. And you still let the bakery advertise the food as safe? The question landed harder because it was fair. I kept correcting what I saw, I said. I wrote procedures, checked labels, and separated the racks. I believed that if the rules were clear enough, people would follow them when I wasn't watching. But they didn't. No. That single answer did not make me responsible for Lydia moving the tray, yet it left no room for me to pretend the kitchen had been well controlled until one sudden mistake. Marion reached for the document bag. After the hospital, food changed in our house. The zipper made a dry, dragging sound. For the first year, Jonah would not eat anything from a bakery, she said. Not even sealed food at school. We read labels in the grocery aisle until other people complained that we were blocking the shelf. I carried 2 injectors in my purse and another set in the car. Jonah gave a short breath that held no humor. Mom used to call restaurants before we left the house. Then she would call again from the parking lot because she thought the first person might have been wrong. I left my job for 7 months, Marion said. His father worked overtime, and the hospital bills kept arriving. The settlement covered those bills. I will not pretend the money did not help. What did they ask for in return? Dana asked. Marion looked toward my attorney. Confidentiality. No public statement beyond what their insurer approved. No direct contact with employees. No separate interview with Audrey Bennett. My chair remained still beneath me, though every muscle across my back had tightened. They specifically named me? I asked. Marion removed a thick folder and set it on the table. Richard said you were emotionally unstable and might tell us things that would interfere with the claim. The room seemed smaller after that. Jonah rubbed one palm across the opposite wrist. For years, I thought you ran because you knew what you had done. I ran because they had already decided what I had done. That may be true, he said. But it did not change what we lived with. No, I said. It didn't. Marion opened the folder. The first document was the settlement agreement, followed by medical invoices, correspondence from the insurer, and an incident report bearing the Bennett's Bakery letterhead. Dana did not reach for anything until Marion gave permission. This is a copy, Marion said. The originals are with our attorney. Thank you, Dana replied. The incident report named me as the person responsible for maintaining the controlled production area. According to the narrative, I had authorized a regular tray to be relabeled after discovering a shortage. The statement was false, but its shape was familiar. Dad had placed the same version in front of me at the kitchen table. A schedule attachment listed the workers present that evening. The times did not match the copy I had seen after the accident. According to this version, my shift continued until after the fundraiser order left the bakery. I was at the community college before 6, I said. My teacher drove me back after the ambulance had already left the school. Dana marked the page with a removable tab. We can verify the presentation schedule and transportation separately. Marion turned to a later attachment. This is what interested our attorney at the time. The document described corrective measures Bennett's Bakery promised to take after the incident. New labeling controls. Additional employee training. Written approval for substitutions. Then I saw the final item. Bennett's Bakery would discontinue the use of reworked filling in products marketed as free from peanuts or tree nuts. I read the sentence again. What is reworked filling? Jonah asked. Usable filling left from one production run and added to a later batch, I said. It can be safe if the products share the same ingredients and allergen category and if the equipment is cleaned correctly. Marion tapped the paper. They told us the accident happened because you changed one label. That is what they told me too. If that was the only problem, Jonah said, why promise to stop reusing filling? Dana turned to the incident report. A production code appeared beside the raspberry squares Jonah had eaten. The old format was shorter than the system used at the factory now. But the final marking was clear. R3. The same code had been printed on the dessert box Lydia handed me at Christmas. The same code appeared on the rework cart beside kettle number 3. Cold gathered across my fingertips despite the warm room. Marion removed a letter printed on Bennett's Bakery stationery. Richard had signed it 2 weeks after the incident. The letter assured the Hale family that the bakery had identified every contributing condition. Staff would receive further training. Label controls would be strengthened. Most important, no filling from a prior production run would be used in any product sold under the bakery's allergen-controlled program. Dad had not written that promise to me. He had written it to the family whose child had been taken away in an ambulance. Dana read the paragraph in silence before looking at Marion. May we obtain a certified copy through your counsel? Yes, Marion said, but Jonah has conditions. He shifted forward, his voice steady. You can give the records to your lawyer, the insurer, investigators, or whoever has legal authority to review them. You cannot use my name in an interview, an advertisement, or a speech about your company. I agree, I said. You cannot put my hospital photograph beside the True Table logo. I would never do that. You do not know what you would do if the company were losing money and your board told you a human story could save it. The answer caught in my throat, because Lydia would have made the same claim. The difference was, that Jonah had earned the right to ask it. I will put the restriction in writing, I said. TrueTable will not use your name, photograph, medical history, or story for promotion. Jonah glanced at Dana. And if I give a statement, I tell all of it. She knew the bakery was cutting corners before the accident. She had rules, but she also knew people did not always follow them. Dana looked toward me. That is accurate, I said. I will not ask you to leave it out. Marion closed the settlement folder but kept Richard's letter on the table. There is one more thing. She pointed to a handwritten note attached to the incident report. The note recorded a call between Richard and the insurer. Dad had argued that reworked filling was common industry practice and could not be proven as the direct cause. He had also insisted that the public statement focus on employee failure rather than process failure. Employee failure meant me. Process failure meant him. For 20 years, I had treated kettle number 3 as a current danger, a shortcut introduced after the bakery expanded. Richard's letter showed something else. He had known about the risk before the factory existed. He had promised to stop using that process, then rebuilt it on a larger scale. Jonah watched me finish reading. I believe your parents lied to us, he said. I have not decided what that makes you. The words were not forgiveness. They were more useful than forgiveness, because they did not ask either of us to pretend the past had become simple. That is fair, I said. When the meeting ended, Marion returned the originals to her bag. Dana left with council-approved copies and permission to request the remaining claim records. I stayed seated until Jonah and his mother had gone. Through the window, I watched them cross the salted parking lot without looking back. Dana placed Richard's letter inside a document sleeve. This changes the direction of the review. Yes, I said. Kettle number 3 was not a new mistake made by a growing company. It was the return of a process my father had promised to end 20 years earlier. Richard's letter did not prove that kettle number 3 had contaminated the current products. It proved something more useful at that stage. My father had known reworked filling could endanger allergen-controlled food 20 years earlier, and he had promised the Hale family he would stop using it. Dana read the letter beside me in her office, then placed it inside a clear sleeve. This gives us a reason to test the plant, she said. It does not give you permission to direct the testing. I understand what you're saying. Her gaze stayed on me. You sent the Christmas cake to your own laboratory before telling your board about the family connection. I understand that mistake too. Then let us avoid learning the same lesson twice. By that afternoon, I had sent written notice to the chair of TrueTable's board. The message disclosed my relationship to Bennett Harth, the proposed transaction, the old allegation, and the preliminary sample I had submitted through our internal laboratory. I also stated that TrueTable would not certify the factory or make an investment decision until an outside review was complete. The board chair acknowledged the notice and asked for copies of everything. There were no congratulations and no accusations, just a request for records and a reminder that any further company involvement required written approval. Dana hired Owen Mercer, an independent food safety auditor who had spent more than 20 years reviewing commercial kitchens, production plants, and recall failures. Despite the shared last name, he was not related to her. Owen did not work for TrueTable, had never consulted for Bennett Harth, and would report his findings through counsel. We met him in a conference room near the factory. Owen was in his late 50s, with heavy glasses and a voice that stayed level whether he was discussing a dirty gasket or a company's possible collapse. The official samples will be collected in front of witnesses, Owen said. Each item gets a source, time, seal number, storage record, and signature. Nobody carries anything home in a tote bag. Nobody drops anything at a friendly laboratory. I accepted the correction without defending myself. Richard did not. This is unnecessary, Dad said. He sat across from Owen with Lydia beside him and a company attorney at the end of the table. We already identified the supplier lot. You identified a possible supplier lot, Owen replied. You did not identify the point where contamination entered the finished product. The preliminary test was positive. On an open material sample, Owen said. We will begin with the sealed retained samples from the same shipment. Richard looked at me. And who pays for this performance? Bennett Harth pays its own review costs, Dana said. TrueTable pays nothing and makes no commitment. Dad's chair moved against the carpet. Your daughter comes home with accusations, drags in lawyers, and now expects us to pay for the privilege. You invited a buyer into a plant under recall, Dana replied. This is what review looks like. The sealed supplier samples were stored in a locked room beside receiving. Their labels matched the starch shipment named in Bennett Hearth's public notice. Owen photographed the seals, checked the intake records, and watched the quality manager open the containers beneath a camera operated by the outside laboratory. I stood behind the marked observation line and touched nothing. 3 days later, the results came back. The sealed samples did not contain peanut protein at a level that could explain what had appeared in the recalled products. A separate intake sample collected when the shipment first arrived was also clean. Lydia read the summary with both elbows on the conference table. That does not clear Midland ingredients, she said. The contamination could have happened after a bag was opened. Owen nodded. That remains possible. Richard gave a thin smile, as though the agreement settled the matter. So we follow the material after opening, Owen continued. We test storage bins, transfer tools, mixers, pumps, kettles, and packaging contact points. We also compare production schedules against sanitation records. The smile left Dad's face. Bennett Hearth provided the 6 recalled lot numbers after Dana sent a formal request. Lydia called the delay an administrative problem. The records showed something else. The same information had been available in the recall file for weeks. Each lot had passed through a raspberry filling stage. 4 products were marketed under the Controlled Allergen Program. 2 were regular holiday products manufactured nearby in the same period. Beside the filling entries appeared the same routing code, R3. Owen projected the production schedule onto a wall while I compared it with the packaging logs. Kettle number 3 had handled reworked raspberry filling for every recalled lot. In several cases, products containing peanut ingredients had run on connected equipment the same day. The schedule did not prove contamination by itself. Proper washing and verification could have separated the runs. The sanitation logs were supposed to show that separation. Instead, they showed full cleaning cycles completed in 42 minutes, 47 minutes, and once in 38. Megan had told me a proper wash usually took around 90 minutes. Some records carried identical signatures written with the same angle and pressure, even when different supervisors were listed on duty. Owen placed 2 copies side by side. Either these employees have remarkably similar handwriting, or someone completed the forms in a group. Lydia crossed her arms. You are not a handwriting examiner. No, Owen said. I am a man reading 6 logs that claim different people made the same unusual loop in the same place. Richard stood near the window with his back partly turned. The electronic system contains the real times. Paper records are backups. Then release the electronic records, Dana said. Our information technology contractor is retrieving them. How long should retrieval take? I asked. Dad turned toward me. Longer when outsiders keep interrupting the staff. The contractor produced the data 2 days later. Several sanitation cycles had been edited after completion. Original entries showed shorter wash periods, while revised entries matched the required minimum. The edits came from an administrator account assigned to Elaine's office. That did not yet prove my mother had made them herself. Shared credentials were common in badly managed companies, and Dana warned me not to claim more than the data supported. The records did prove someone with office access had changed the sanitation history. Owen arranged an observed cleaning of kettle number 3 using the shortened procedure employees said they had been instructed to follow during the Christmas rush. The equipment had just processed a product containing peanut ingredients. After the reduced cycle, technicians collected surface swabs from the pump connection, the underside of the lid, and a narrow gasket near the discharge valve. Every sample was labeled, sealed, and carried directly to the outside laboratory. I watched from behind the line while Owen signed the final custody form. 48 hours later, 2 locations tested positive for residual peanut protein. The full approved cleaning procedure was then completed, including disassembly of the pump connection and extended rinsing. A second round of swabs came back clean. The supplier had not created the main failure. The shortened cleaning procedure had allowed residue to remain inside Bennett Hearth's own equipment. Richard attacked the test before Owen finished presenting it. "You created an artificial condition," Dad said. "Our employees do not run that abbreviated cycle after peanut products." Owen opened the production records. "Your logs show that cycle on 11 dates. Those are paper errors. The electronic timestamps show it too." Lydia looked toward the company attorney. "Can we stop this meeting until our own consultant reviews the method?" "You may hire anyone you choose," Dana said. "The samples and process records will remain available." Paul Dwyer, the shift manager, had been sitting at the far end of the table. His binder remained closed in front of him. Owen addressed him directly. "Mr. Dwyer, were employees instructed to shorten cleaning between runs?" Paul rubbed both palms against his trousers. "Not in those exact words." "What instructions were you given?" Owen asked. "To keep the schedule moving." Richard's voice hardened. "Choose your words carefully, Paul." The shift manager looked at my father, then at the plant attorney. "We were told not to waste usable product and not to leave kettles sitting empty when orders were backed up." "Did you ever request separate equipment for allergen-controlled filling?" Owen asked. Paul's mouth moved before sound came. "I submitted 2 requests." "What response did you receive?" Owen asked. "The capital request was denied." "Who denied the request?" Owen asked. Paul stared at the binder. "Mr. Bennett." Richard pushed away from the table. "The request was denied because the existing equipment was adequate when procedures were followed." Paul finally looked up. "We could not follow a 90-minute wash and make the schedule you approved." The room went quiet except for the ventilation fan. "How many sanitation logs did you sign even when the full cycle had not been completed?" Dana asked. The company attorney objected before Paul could answer. Dana clarified that he did not have to respond without his own counsel. Paul swallowed. "Enough that I should have said something sooner." He was not a brave employee who had spent years secretly fighting management. He had complained, then accepted the answer, signed records, collected paychecks, and told himself the next run would be different. Fear explained part of it. It did not erase the rest. Owen asked Bennett Harth to produce communications about cleaning time, waste reduction, and kettle number 3. The company attorney said the request was too broad. Dana narrowed it by date, sender, and subject. The first email came from Richard 3 weeks before the earliest recalled lot. "Production cannot absorb another 90-minute shutdown between compatible runs. Use the abbreviated cycle where the product family allows it. We are not throwing away inventory that can be saved." The language sounded ordinary. Cost control. Efficiency. Compatible products. Nothing in the message said to endanger customers. The production schedule attached to it included peanut products, followed by controlled raspberry products. A manager replied that the gasket and pump connection could retain residue unless the equipment was opened and washed fully. Richard answered that quality staff should verify the abbreviated process without holding up shipping. Elaine was copied on the exchange. Lydia received the quality report 5 days later. The report warned that the abbreviated cleaning cycle had not been validated for transitions involving peanut ingredients. It recommended stopping controlled production on kettle number 3 until either the full cleaning time was restored or dedicated equipment was installed. At the bottom of the report appeared an electronic acknowledgement from Lydia Bennett. I read the date twice. 3 weeks before the recall. Lydia sat across from me while Owen displayed the next document. It was a release authorization covering several holiday lots, including 2 later recalled. The forms stated that allergen-controlled products had been manufactured on separated equipment under validated cleaning procedures. Her signature appeared at the bottom. "You knew the abbreviated cycle had not been validated," I said. Lydia's chin lifted. "I knew quality had concerns. That is not the same as confirming contamination. They recommended stopping the line. They recommend stopping everything. That is their job. And yours was to decide whether children could eat what you sold." Richard cut in. "Audrey, you are not conducting this interview." He was right about that much. I looked toward Dana and stopped speaking. Owen continued with dates, signatures, and lot numbers. The facts did not need my anger to make them heavier. At 14, Lydia had moved 1 tray because she wanted to avoid disappointing our father. At 34, she had received a written warning, signed a release, and allowed the products to leave the factory. The first act had belonged to a frightened child. The current one belonged to the chief executive officer. My phone vibrated against the conference table as the meeting ended. The message came from TrueTable's communications director. A regional morning program had announced its lead interview for the following day. The title appeared beneath Lydia's publicity photograph: How My Estranged Sister Tried to Take Our Family Business. The television producer had chosen a photograph of Lydia standing between our parents outside Bennett Hearth. All three wore matching blue aprons, and a line of employees filled the background beneath a banner that read, "Every family deserves a safe place at the table." I watched the interview from Dana's office the next morning. The host began with the product recall, but Lydia redirected the conversation before he finished his first question. "This is not only about a technical problem," my sister said. "It is about what happens when someone who left a family business returns after 20 years and sees a chance to take control." The camera moved closer. Lydia described herself as the daughter who had stayed. She had worked weekends, survived rising ingredient prices, kept the factory open during the pandemic, and learned the names of employees' children. Audrey, according to her version, had left town after a family disagreement and refused every attempt at reconciliation. No one asked her to name those attempts. "She came back after seeing that our company was under pressure," Lydia continued. "Then she offered to help only if her company gained control of our plant." "That is false," I said. Dana muted the television. "She did not say you made a formal offer. She wants people to hear that I did." "Yes, and answering while you are angry will help her." On the screen, Lydia held up the Christmas contract. She did not show the provisions about shared process history, commercial claims, or use of TrueTable's safety seal. From the audience's view, it was simply an investment agreement offered to a wealthy sister who had refused to save a struggling hometown employer. The host asked about the contaminated products. "We are cooperating fully with an independent review," Lydia said. "There are questions involving a supplier and questions involving old procedures that originated long before I became chief executive. We are correcting what needs to be corrected." She did not deny the failed sanitation cycles. She called them questions. Then the program displayed interviews with 3 employees outside the factory. One woman worried about losing the health insurance that covered her husband's medication. A man said Bennett Hearth had employed 2 generations of his family. Neither employee attacked me directly, but the message was clear. A woman worth $50 million was standing between ordinary people and their paychecks. By lunchtime, local social media had divided into camps. Some comments asked why Bennett Hearth had ignored safety warnings. Others called me greedy, bitter, and ashamed of where I came from. A former classmate wrote that I had always believed I was better than everyone else. A church group shared Lydia's interview with the words "Pray for this family" and the workers caught in the middle. My communications director, Rachel Kim, called before I had finished reading the first page. "We have requests from 6 outlets," Rachel said. "I recommend that you do not answer any of them until the board meets." "Lydia just accused me of trying to steal a company." "She implied it," Rachel replied. "That distinction matters if we respond. I have the sanitation results. And you are related to the people who control the plant. We need an independent voice presenting those results." I stood beside Dana's window and watched sleet darken the sidewalk. "Silence makes it look as though I have no answer." "Silence for one day is not surrender," Rachel said. "But we cannot stay silent forever." That afternoon, one of TrueTable's largest retail partners postponed an expansion planned for spring. They did not cancel our existing agreement. Their letter said the company needed clarity about my family relationship, TrueTable's role in the Bennett Hearth review, and whether our internal laboratory had been used in a personal dispute. The last question led directly to the sample in Dana's cabinet. Our board meeting began at 8 the next morning. I joined from TrueTable's main conference room while outside counsel, 2 board members, and the audit committee chair appeared on the screen. No one raised a voice. That made the meeting harder. The chair, Helen Brooks, had invested in TrueTable when we still operated from a rented warehouse. She knew how many times I had refused a faster contract because the supplier records were incomplete. "Tell us about the first positive sample," Helen said. I described the dessert box Lydia had handed me at Christmas. The packaging was sealed when I received it, and I had photographed the label before placing it in an insulated bag. After returning to the hotel, I arranged for the box to be delivered to our laboratory. Did anyone independent witness your sister give you the box? Outside counsel asked. No. Was the temperature recorded from the time you received it? No. Did you notify the board about the family dispute before using the laboratory? No. I disclosed it after the preliminary result. Helen removed her glasses. Why? Because I wanted to know whether the code on the box mattered. That explains your reason, she said. It does not answer why company resources were used before disclosure. The room stayed quiet while I looked at the positive report lying beside my notebook. I believed I could separate a reference test from a company decision, I said. I should have disclosed the conflict first. One director asked whether I had altered the sample. No. Another asked whether the result was false. There is no reason to think it was false, I replied. But the handling history is not strong enough for the sample to establish where or when contamination occurred. Helen nodded once. That is the answer that should have been in our records from the beginning? The board did not remove me as chief executive. They did not accuse me of fraud or tell me to abandon the Bennett review. They required me to recuse myself from every True Table decision involving Bennett Hearth. The audit committee would oversee company communications, laboratory questions, and any possible acquisition. Owen's outside review would continue through Dana, not through me. I could provide information as a witness and family member, but I could not direct the company's response. The decision was reasonable. It still felt like having my own hands tied while Lydia walked through every television studio she could find. After the meeting, Rachel placed a draft statement on my desk. It disclosed that I was related to Bennett Hearth's owners, acknowledged that the first reference sample lacked a complete custody record, and confirmed that all formal testing was being handled independently. I hate this sentence, I said. Rachel read the line I had marked. Which part? The part where it sounds as though the sample is worthless. It is not worthless, she said. It helped point toward a problem. It simply cannot carry the case. If we publish this, Lydia will say I mishandled evidence. She will say that whether we publish it or not. The question is whether we allow her to reveal it first. Dana arrived 10 minutes later and found me drafting a longer statement of my own. I had listed the clean supplier samples, the failed surface swabs, the altered sanitation times, and Lydia's signature on the release form. Dana read the first paragraph, then closed my laptop. You do not have authority to release Owen's working material, she said. I can release what I personally saw. You can also warn everyone inside Bennett Hearth exactly which records matter most. They already know. Some do, some may not. An employee who sees her name spreading online may stop cooperating. A manager who realizes his email has not been recovered may decide to lose a phone. You will also give Richard a chance to claim the review was designed for publicity rather than safety. My chair rolled back as I stood. So Lydia gets to say whatever she wants while we protect the people who lied? We protect the process that can prove they lied. The sentence stopped me. For most of my adult life, control had meant safety. I checked supplier certificates myself, read the fine print, and kept copies in more than one place. When something mattered, I stayed close enough to see every hand that touched it. That habit had helped me build True Table. Now it was creating an opening for my family. If I held every record, directed every test, and delivered every accusation, Richard could reduce the entire matter to one estranged daughter's revenge. The truth needed witnesses who did not owe me anything. I reopened Rachel's shorter statement. We added one sentence confirming that I had stepped away from company decisions involving Bennett Hearth. Another stated that the limits of the first sample had been disclosed to the board and that all formal findings would come from independent testing. I signed my name beneath it. By evening, several national food safety writers had shared the statement. Some criticized my early use of the company laboratory. Others noted that I had disclosed the mistake and accepted oversight. The noise did not disappear, but Lydia no longer controlled every word. Mom called the following Sunday. I was at home reviewing a True Table supplier file unrelated to Bennett Hearth when her name appeared on my phone. I let it ring once before answering and opened a blank document on my computer. Audrey, this has gone too far, Elaine said. Which part? The auditors, the lawyers, people asking questions at church. Your father cannot even buy groceries without someone staring at him. A recall affects more than grocery shopping. I am trying to speak to you as your mother. You can speak. I am taking notes. Her breathing changed. Must you make everything sound threatening? A written record prevents misunderstandings. She was silent for several seconds. Lydia is willing to correct the story about the old accident. What correction? We would say that both of you played a part. She moved the tray, but the system was yours and you were responsible for training her. The old offer had returned in cleaner clothes. 20 years earlier, they wanted me to accept the whole lie. Now they wanted me to accept half of it so Lydia could escape the rest. I did not authorize that tray, I said. I was not in the bakery when she moved it. You designed rules that a 14-year-old could not follow. She followed the rule until she chose not to. Mom's voice sharpened. There it is. You have always wanted her punished. No, I wanted the truth told when it mattered. If you withdraw the report and stop pushing the factory review, we can release a family statement. We can say both daughters made mistakes, everyone has grown, and the business is moving forward. What happens to the current recall? That is a separate matter. No, it is the same matter, the same shortcut returned. You do not know what it takes to keep a company alive, Elaine said. You walked away before you had to make difficult choices. I looked around the office I had paid for through years of difficult choices. I will not withdraw anything, and I will not sign a statement sharing responsibility for Lydia's actions. You may change your mind when 200 families lose their income. Did Richard use the house as collateral? The question broke her rhythm. What are you talking about? Mom asked. Ask him. I ended the call, wrote the time, duration, and exact offer into my notes, then sent the memorandum to Dana. Richard called less than an hour later. He did not mention the house. Instead, he offered TrueTable a larger ownership share, preferred repayment of the $5 million, and a seat on Bennett Hearth's board. I would not have to manage the factory or appear beside Lydia. You get the financial return without the family complications, Dad said, and TrueTable still lends its name, only as a technical partner. Does the new agreement remove the shared history acknowledgement? His pause answered before his words did. That language protects both businesses, Richard said. It protects you. I am offering you more than most investors would receive. You are asking for something no ordinary investor could give you. What is that? My name beside the process. Richard released a slow breath. You have spent 20 years making money from what you learned in my bakery. Do not pretend you built TrueTable out of nothing. I built it after you told the town I could not be trusted around food. And now you have a chance to put the past behind us. No, you have a chance to place it under my signature. He ended the call without saying goodbye. I documented that conversation too. 2 days later, Lydia posted a scanned document on the Bennett Hearth website. Her statement claimed that I had concealed my role in creating the original bakery safety system while attacking the company for using it. The scan showed color codes, rack separation, production cards, and the blue triangle mark. Anyone looking at it could reach one of two conclusions. If the system had been defective, I carried responsibility. If it had been valuable, Bennett Hearth had every right to treat it as family property. My name did not appear on the displayed page. I knew the diagram anyway. The uneven line beside the utensil cabinet came from a ruler that had slipped while I was drawing it at Mrs. Collins's dining table. A small ink mark near the bottom had been left by her cat stepping on the page before it dried. Lydia had not posted a company document. She had posted part of my scholarship presentation. I called Mrs. Collins, who had retired to Arizona years earlier. She remembered the project and told me she had returned a box of my school papers after I finished community college. That box had been stored in TrueTable's old records warehouse after my last office move. I drove there with Dana the next morning. Dust coated the tops of the cartons, and the heating system made a hollow knocking sound above the metal shelves. The presentation folder was in the fourth box. Inside were my dated submission letter, diagrams, test notes, and the page Lydia had posted with the upper section removed. The missing section contained the project title and my name. Beneath it sat a copy of the presentation I had mailed to my food science advisor 3 weeks before Jonah's accident. A handwritten note ran across the cover. Bennett Bakery Trial, Audrey Protocol. By the first week of February, the box from my old records warehouse had been moved to Dana's office and placed beneath a camera before anyone opened it again. Mrs. Collins joined us by video from Arizona, wearing reading glasses on a chain and the same expression she had used when students arrived without homework. Professor Ruth Ellison, the food science advisor who had reviewed my scholarship project in 2005, sat beside Dana with a copy of her archived correspondence. Mrs. Collins identified the dining room table where I had drawn the diagrams. She remembered the black ink mark left by her cat and the envelope she had driven me to mail. Professor Ellison produced the letter she had received 3 weeks before Jonah's accident, along with handwritten comments dated in the college mailroom. "This was a student project when it reached me," Professor Ellison said. Audrey described a color-coded separation system, dedicated tools, production cards, cleaning intervals, and limits on reusing ingredients. She also wrote that her family bakery had agreed to test it. Dana asked whether that meant I owned every later procedure Bennett Hearth used. "No," Professor Ellison replied. "The bakery changed it, expanded it, and operated it for years. I can confirm when Audrey developed these ideas and what the early system contained. Ownership of every later version is a different question. That distinction mattered. I had proof that the system existed under my name before my family blamed me for ignoring it. I did not have a magic document giving me a factory, a brand, or every recipe sold under the Bennett name. Richard would have called that a weakness. I saw it as a boundary. The scholarship file could prove they had lied about who understood safety. It could also prove that the expensive parts of my system had been stripped away, while the visible parts were kept for customers to admire." Nora brought the next set of records 2 days later. She arrived at Dana's office carrying a grocery bag wrapped around an old training binder. The cover had warped, and flowers still clung inside the plastic sleeve near the spine. "I took this home when Richard told us to throw out old manuals after the factory opened," Nora said. "I thought he might decide the old bakery never had procedures at all." The first section had been typed on a home printer. Blue racks. Blue triangle cards. Dedicated utensils. A complete cleaning cycle after any product containing peanuts or tree nuts. No reworked filling moved into controlled batches. Across the top, someone had written Audrey Protocol. "That is Paul's handwriting," Nora said. He was a junior mixer back then. Several years later, the same pages had been copied into a polished manual titled Bennett Safe Table Program. My name disappeared. The blue bands and triangle labels remained, but the full cleaning instructions had been shortened. A later revision allowed reworked filling to move between products described as compatible. "Compatible according to what?" Dana asked. Nora shook her head. "Whatever production needed that week." The oldest manual told employees to discard filling when its prior equipment history could not be confirmed. The newer one told them to seek supervisor approval. That single change moved the final decision away from a written rule and into the hands of managers working under shipping deadlines. I turned another page and found a photograph of Lydia beside a blue-banded rack. Beneath it, the manual praised her for bringing modern safety practices to the family business. She had kept the color of my work and removed its cost. The worst part came from the videos. Rachel found years of Bennett Hearth interviews, local news clips, retailer presentations, and holiday cooking segments. We watched them inside a conference room with the blinds closed, though no one outside could have heard the sound. In one early interview, Lydia stood inside the original bakery and described the company's growth. "We had to rebuild trust after a member of our own family made a terrible mistake," she told the host. "I was young, but I promised myself we would never let one careless decision define us." The program cut to blue utensils and labeled racks. A later retailer video went further. "My sister developed a complicated system that failed under real kitchen pressure," Lydia said. "I simplified it, trained the team, and turned safety into part of our culture." She had been 14 when she moved the tray. By the time that video was recorded, she was 28. Smiling beneath studio lights while a grocery executive praised her leadership. Another clip showed her accepting a regional business award. She thanked our parents for teaching her that trust had to be earned back one customer at a time. The audience applauded. No one asked whose name had been used to create the loss of trust in the first place. I watched Lydia build her public story from the ruins of mine. She had not simply remained silent while Richard and Elaine protected her. She had turned my disgrace into the opening chapter of her success. Rachel paused the video. "We can issue a correction with the dated scholarship material." "Not yet," Dana said. "The records should be preserved and verified before public use." My hands remained folded on the table. Collect every version. Dates, sponsors, retailer copies, transcripts. Dana looked toward me. For a lawsuit? For the truth about the brand, I said. I'm not claiming every cookie recipe. I want a record of what they sold people. That afternoon, Owen's team delivered an export from Bennett Hearth's administrative accounts. The company's attorney had agreed to produce communications tied to sanitation, the recall, and the old safety program. Buried among scheduling messages was an email Elaine had sent to the human resources manager after the first retailer demanded a full insurance history. Please make sure the legacy training records align with the version already provided to the insurer. We do not need old drafts, creating confusion. The human resources manager had answered with a question. Do you want the handwritten logs removed from the active file? Elaine replied 12 minutes later. Move them to archive and replace the index. Keep only the approved version in the audit folder. Dana read the exchange twice. This does not prove she wrote every altered entry. No, I said. It proves she was still managing which version people were allowed to see. A document specialist compared the old carbon copy Nora had saved with the copy from the Hale settlement file. She did not claim she could name the writer from one page. Instead, she identified the order in which the entries had been made. The original shift time had been written first. A darker time was added later, after the carbon copy had separated from the top sheet. The revised entry extended my shift past the moment the fundraiser boxes left the bakery. Nora provided a sworn statement that Elaine collected the production cards after Jonah was taken to the hospital. Mrs. Collins confirmed I had been at the community college during the revised time. The insurer's copy showed the later entry. Elaine's current email showed the same habit 20 years later. Select one version, move the rest out of sight, and call disagreement confusion. One page did not bring her down. The chain did. When Dana laid out the scholarship file, training manuals, videos, altered shift records, and current emails, the pattern no longer depended on my memory. My mother had not spent 2 decades standing quietly beside Richard. She had maintained the family's version of events as carefully as she maintained payroll. Dana gave me several options. We can send a demand over the old materials and the false source story, she said. We can also prepare claims involving authorship, unfair competition, and misuse of your name. But none of those claims gives you an instant right to Bennett Hearth. How long would it take? Long enough to complicate any sale or restructuring. If both sides claim key parts of the safety system, a buyer may wait until the dispute is resolved. Lenders may freeze decisions. The factory could run out of cash before anyone wins. I looked through the glass wall at the staff, working beyond Dana's conference room. None of them belonged to Bennett Hearth. Yet the same question had followed me since Christmas. Who should pay for what my family had done? Richard wanted employees to carry the risk of his choices. Lydia wanted customers to carry it. Elaine wanted me to carry it because I had survived before. I would not answer by trapping 200 workers inside a lawsuit designed to prove that every blue band belonged to me. Use the records to challenge their public story, I said. Use them to show the insurer and creditors that the brand value was built on false statements. Preserve any claim we may need, but do not seek an order that freezes the plant. Dana capped her pen. That may mean leaving money on the table. It is not their money I want. What do you want? Their ability to sell the lie as an asset. The decision narrowed our target. We would not demand the recipes, the building, or every later process. We would establish that Bennett Hearth's safety story was false, that my work predated the accusation, and that the family had removed safeguards while keeping the symbols. By then, the blue bands were no longer evidence of a trustworthy system. They were decoration wrapped around a shortcut. 3 nights later, an unfamiliar number called while I was leaving True Table's office. I almost sent it to voicemail. Then the caller tried again before I reached the elevator. Audrey? Lydia's voice was low and uneven. Do not say my name. The hallway was empty. I stepped back into my office and closed the door. Where are you calling from? A phone Dad does not know about. What do you want? I need to meet you without him, Mom, or their lawyer. You have your own attorney? Not yet. Then get one before you hand me anything. Her breath caught against the receiver. You do not understand. Dad has prepared a statement saying I changed the cleaning schedules without his approval. It says I hid the quality report and told Elaine to correct the records after the recall. Did you? I signed the release. I did not create the production targets. That was not my question. Silence stretched between us. I knew the full cleaning was not happening every time, Lydia said. I thought the risk was being managed. Dad said quality was protecting itself with paperwork. And you believed him because shipping continued. I believed him because he owned the company. You were the chief executive. He controlled the bank, the board, and every major contract. Her excuse had truth inside it, but not enough to carry what she had signed. How did you find the statement? I asked. Elaine left a folder open in Dad's office. The draft says I acted outside my authority and concealed the warnings from him. He wrote that he learned about the shortened cycles only after the recall. Do you have a copy? I photographed 3 pages. Send them to your lawyer, not to me. I called you because you know what he does when he needs someone to blame. The words did not make us sisters again. They only showed that Lydia had finally heard the same door closing behind her that I had heard at 18. What are you asking for? I said. Protection. I cannot promise immunity, employment, money, or a place inside True Table. I am not asking to work for you. Then bring the documents through counsel, preserve the original messages, and tell the truth about your own decisions, not just Richard's. Her voice tightened. You want me to confess before you help me? I want you to stop calling self-preservation honesty. For several seconds, all I heard was the faint rush of traffic near her phone. If I cooperate, will you keep my name out of the press until the review is complete? Lydia asked. I will not release material I do not control, and I will not use Jonah's story or yours as advertising. That is all I can promise. You really will let them prosecute me. I will not lie to prevent it. A door closed somewhere near Lydia. When she spoke again, the words came quickly. The draft has already been signed in pencil and scanned to Dad's private attorney. If the bank calls a formal meeting, he plans to submit it as his statement of events. Lydia arrived at Dana's office with her own attorney and a banker's box she refused to set on the floor. 3 weeks had passed since her call from the unlisted phone. In that time, Dana had insisted that any meeting occur through counsel, that every document be copied without altering its original form, and that Lydia understand one point before she entered the room. Cooperation was not immunity. My sister sat across from me in a navy coat she did not remove. Her attorney, Evan Pike, placed a digital recorder in the center of the table after everyone consented. Dana opened a fresh legal pad, but left the first page blank. Lydia kept one hand on the box. I need to know what Audrey plans to do with this, she said. Dana answered before I could. Miss Bennett may provide relevant material to auditors, insurers, creditors, regulators, or law enforcement. She will not promise to conceal evidence. I am asking about her, Lydia said, not an agency. I will not use your documents in advertising, I said. I will not post them online. And I will not promise that you avoid consequences. Her mouth tightened. Then why would I help you? Because Richard has already decided you are the next person responsible for everything. She looked down at the cardboard lid. Evan spoke quietly. My client is prepared to provide material voluntarily, but she wants the record to reflect that she is cooperating before any formal demand. Dana can document when you produced it, I said. The rest depends on whether you tell the truth. Lydia lifted the lid. On top sat the 3 photographed pages from Richard's draft statement. Beneath them were printed emails, internal reports, handwritten notes from meetings, and a flash drive sealed inside a plastic evidence pouch prepared by Evan's office. Dana did not touch the drive. Where did the electronic files come from? My company account and a backup of messages Richard sent to my personal address, Lydia said. Evan's forensic vendor made the copy. We will still verify them against the company's server, Dana replied. I expected that. The draft statement carried Richard's corrections in pencil. In one margin, he had changed approved by senior management to implemented without ownership authorization. Another note instructed his private attorney to emphasize that Lydia controlled daily production. At the bottom of the last page, my father had written one sentence. If necessary, distinguish founder oversight from executive misconduct. Founder oversight meant Richard. Executive misconduct meant Lydia. He was going to call you careless, I said. The same way he called me careless. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment. I did not know about this statement until I found it. That was not what I asked. Her gaze returned to mine. I knew the cleaning cycles were being shortened, she said. I knew quality had not approved the process for every transition. And you signed the release forms. Yes. Did you believe the products were safe? I believed the risk was low. Based on testing? Based on what Dad told me and what production had done before. Dana's pen remained still. Evan shifted in his chair, but Lydia kept speaking. Richard said the warning was written to protect the quality department if anything went wrong. He said the residue would be below a meaningful level after heating and dilution. He is not a food safety specialist. He owned the plant. You were the chief executive. The words stayed between us. Lydia's hand moved from the box to the edge of the table. You think that title gave me control over him? It gave you responsibility for what you signed. I could not replace equipment without his approval. You could have stopped the affected line and missed the holiday contracts. We would have breached retailer agreements and lost the bank. You chose the bank. I chose 200 jobs. No, I said. You chose to ship first and let customers carry the risk. Evan raised one hand. Audrey, my client has agreed to answer questions, but this is not a deposition. Dana looked at me. I sat back. At 14, Lydia had moved one tray because she wanted to avoid our father's anger. At 34, she had received a written warning and signed products out of the factory anyway. The first decision had taken minutes. The second had been renewed every time another lot left the loading dock. Lydia pulled a folded page from her coat pocket. There is something else, she said. It was a copy of an internal memo dated 7 years earlier. The document summarized a records review conducted before Bennett Hearth signed its first major grocery contract. Lydia had found discrepancies between the old production logs and the version supplied to the insurer after Jonah's reaction. The memo included the original shift time. It placed me at the community college before the fundraiser order left the bakery. You knew, I said. Lydia did not look away. I found it during due diligence. 7 years ago. Yes. What did you do? I gave it to Mom. And she said the old records were unreliable. Dad said reopening the settlement could destroy the retail deal and expose the company to claims. So you put it back in the file. I had one memo. You already had a successful company by then. My fingers pressed against the arms of the chair. That was your reason? You had rebuilt your life, Lydia said. I thought changing the public story would only reopen everything. You continued telling reporters that my mistake forced you to rebuild trust. Her eyes dropped to the recorder. I should not have said those things. You said them because they made you valuable. Lydia's face tightened, but she did not deny it. The banker's box had become lighter. The room had not. After the meeting, Dana copied the paper records and arranged verification of the electronic material. Lydia left with Evan without asking to speak to me alone. I watched the elevator doors close, then returned to the conference room. She gave us enough to hurt all three of them, I said. She gave us enough to investigate. Dana replied. That is different. On the table remained an email chain between Richard, Lydia, and the private attorney who had drafted the Christmas agreement. Dana opened the contract beside it and began matching the language. The $5 million had never been a simple rescue investment. The first portion would satisfy the bank's demand for additional reserves. Without it, the lender could freeze Bennett Hearth's credit line. The second portion would fund recalls, retailer refunds, and payroll while the plant remained under review. That part explained the urgency. The rest explained why they needed me. True Table would acquire operational control of the affected facility and allow Bennett Hearth to display our safety seal during the transition. Retailers who no longer trusted Lydia might continue buying if my company stood behind the plant. Claims involving products sold after the transfer would be handled through the new operating structure. Bennett Hearth would remain exposed for its own conduct, but True Table could be forced to pay, defend, or settle many commercial disputes, while the two companies argued over who caused what. Then came the legacy language. The agreement stated that both companies' safety systems grew from a common family process developed inside the original bakery. By signing, I would help Bennett Hearth argue that the old system had always involved me, that any weakness was inherited rather than concealed, and that the current failure came from a shared technical history. They cannot make me legally responsible for Lydia moving the tray, I said. No, Dana replied, but they can place your signature beside a statement that makes the past less clear. Insurers, retailers, and opposing lawyers would use it. The final clause required Truetable to release claims involving pre-existing procedures, training materials, and methods used at Bennett Hearth. They keep everything they took, I said. They gain a contractual defense against you challenging it later. I turned to the email chain. Richard's private attorney had warned that the shared history language might alarm my counsel. Richard answered that family pressure should secure agreement before a full board review. Lydia had replied with a shorter message. Once Audrey is inside the operation, any later failure can be treated as a transition problem rather than a Bennett-only problem. The message had been sent 9 days before Christmas. My sister had known exactly why they wanted me at that table. Another email discussed how retailer complaints should be routed after the proposed transfer. Richard wrote that Truetable's involvement would create a reasonable basis to describe future issues as integration failures. Then, in a separate chain with his private attorney, he prepared the statement blaming Lydia in case I refused to sign, and the investigation continued. Dana arranged both documents beside each other. If you signed, she said, Richard planned to shift future pressure toward Truetable and call the failures part of integration. And if I refused, he planned to say Lydia acted without his approval. 2 exits. Each one required a daughter to stand between Richard and the consequences of his decisions. For 20 years, I had believed he chose Lydia over me because she was the child he loved more. The draft statement removed that last excuse. My father did not protect daughters. He protected the Bennett name, and whoever could preserve it remained useful until the day she could not. The easiest response would have been to publish everything. Rachel could have assembled the emails, the old video clips, the sanitation results, and the altered records into one public statement. By evening, every reporter who had repeated Lydia's version would have had a new headline. Dana advised against it. The insurer is still reviewing coverage, she said. Creditors have not completed their analysis, and some employee witnesses remain inside the plant. Public release may cause records to disappear, frighten people into silence, or give Richard grounds to attack the review as a publicity campaign. He is already attacking me publicly. That does not mean you should copy his method. I looked through the conference room window toward the hallway. A young associate walked past, carrying 3 binders against her chest. Ordinary work continued while I sat with enough material to destroy the public image my family had built. Revenge offered speed. Accountability required patience. Richard and Elaine requested a meeting 2 days later. They refused Dana's office, so we met in a private room at Bennett Hearth with counsel present on both sides. Lydia did not attend. Dad remained standing beside the window while Mom sat at the table with a folder of payroll figures. If the bank freezes the line, we miss payroll within 3 weeks, Elaine said. Then health coverage stops. Vendors go unpaid. People who did nothing wrong lose everything. I studied the figures without touching them. Has the bank demanded that you leave management? Richard answered from the window. The bank has demanded a credible plan. Would you accept independent management during restructuring? His head turned toward me. This company is not being handed to strangers. Would you step down if it kept the factory open? I built this business. That was not my question. Mom leaned forward. Your father's name is on every guarantee. Asking him to walk away is asking him to surrender his life. And asking me to invest under that contract was asking me to surrender mine. Elaine's voice softened. Audrey, we can revise the language. You can have more control than Lydia. The employees would know you saved them. I will not invest while any of you control production, records, or safety decisions. Dad left the window. Then you want the plant to close. I want the people who created the problem removed from authority. You want the Bennett name erased. If the name matters more than keeping the employees working, that is your choice. His face hardened. There is no company without that name. There it was. Not the workers, not the town, not even the recipes. The name? Richard would let the factory fail before allowing it to continue without him attached to the front. Elaine closed the payroll folder. When those families lose their homes, they will know who refused to help. They should know who refused to step aside. The meeting ended without an agreement. That evening, Dana introduced me to Marisol Vega, the employee representative chosen by a group from production, packaging, shipping, and maintenance. She had worked at Bennett Hearth for 11 years and did not trust me simply because I opposed Richard. "You are talking about buying assets," Marisol said. "Workers hear that and think layoffs. Some positions may not survive," I said. "I will not promise every job. At least you said it. I also will not use personal money to pay every Bennett debt. Any plan has to pass independent review." Marisol folded her arms. What would stay? The usable equipment, legitimate retailer contracts, and as much of the workforce as the operation can support. Safety would report outside production. Anyone involved in changing records would be reviewed before rehire. And the family? No Bennett family member would control the new operation. Including you? If TrueTable bids, I remain recused from the transaction. The board and an independent committee decide whether to proceed. She watched me for a long moment. Then what do you get? A plant that can keep producing without asking workers or customers to protect a family name. Over the next week, Dana, Marisol, outside restructuring counsel, and TrueTable's independent committee built the outline of a possible path. Records would be preserved before any transfer. An outside manager could stabilize operations. Creditors could supervise the sale of clean assets. Employees who had not participated in concealment could apply to remain. Old claims would stay where the law placed them instead of vanishing into the new company. Nothing guaranteed success. The bank could still close the credit line. Retailers could walk away. Insurance coverage could shrink. TrueTable's board could reject any purchase. But for the first time, the employees had an option that did not require me to sign my family's contract or Richard to keep control. On a wet morning in the middle of March, Dana forwarded a joint notice from Bennett Hearth's lender and insurance carrier. They had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following week. Richard, Elaine, Lydia, Paul, the outside auditor, creditor representatives, and counsel were required to attend. Each member of my family would have to state what they knew, when they knew it, and who controlled the decisions. The notice ended with one warning. If the meeting failed to produce a credible preservation and management plan, the lender could suspend operating funds before the next payroll cycle. For the first time in 20 years, all three of them would enter a room where none of them controlled the records. The emergency meeting began at 9 on a Thursday morning in late March, inside a windowless conference room at the bank that held Bennett Hearth's credit line. Dana and I arrived first. Marisol Vega joined us 10 minutes later with a folder of written questions from production, packaging, shipping, and maintenance. She had asked employees what mattered if the company changed hands. Their answers were plain: keep the plant open if it could operate safely, protect earned wages and health coverage, and do not leave the same people in charge. "We are not asking the bank to give TrueTable anything," I reminded Dana before the others entered. "We are presenting a workable path." Dana adjusted the stack of exhibits in front of her. "And when Richard says this is revenge?" I let the records answer. "That will be harder than it sounds." She was right. I had imagined this room for weeks, yet sitting there made the old part of me want to speak first, speak longest, and close every exit before my family could rewrite the day. Instead, I opened my notebook to a single page. Protect the records. Protect the workers. Remove the people who created the risk. Nothing about punishment appeared there. Grace Hollis, the bank's restructuring officer, took the chair at the head of the table. The bank had not seized Bennett Hearth, but the company had violated conditions attached to its loans, and its operating funds could be suspended. Grace explained that the bank was willing to consider a short period of continued funding only if the meeting produced a credible plan to preserve evidence, stabilize production, and replace conflicted management. The insurer's lawyer sat on her right. Owen occupied a seat near the screen with his audit files. Paul Dwyer arrived with separate counsel and took the place nearest the door. My family entered together but did not sit together. Richard chose the chair opposite Grace. Elaine settled beside the company attorney and arranged a tissue on her lap before anyone spoke. Lydia sat at the far end with Evan Pike, leaving 2 empty chairs between herself and our parents. That distance told the room more than any opening statement could have. Grace began with Richard. "Mr. Bennett, please explain your understanding of the contamination event and the decisions made afterward." Dad folded his hands on the table. His voice had the calm weight he once used with suppliers who were about to accept less money than they wanted. Bennett Hearth received contaminated material from Midland Ingredients, Richard said. My daughter Lydia handled the public response. We began a voluntary recall, cooperated with testing, and invited Audrey to discuss a rescue investment. Instead, she used an old family disagreement to interfere with the company. Grace did not react. What evidence supports the supplier conclusion? Richard turned toward Owen. The preliminary sample was positive. Owen opened the laboratory summary. The opened sample produced a trace result. Sealed samples from the same shipment were clean, as was the intake sample collected when the material reached the plant. That does not eliminate contamination after opening, Richard said. No, Owen replied. It does eliminate the claim that the sealed shipment arrived in the condition described in your public statement. Dad looked toward the insurer's lawyer. The supplier controlled the product until delivery. Your own records show the positive finished lots passed through kettle number 3, Owen said. Observed testing found peanut residue after the shortened wash procedure used during the holiday schedule. The full approved wash removed it. Richard's fingers pressed together. That procedure was not authorized by ownership. Dana placed the first email on the screen. Production cannot absorb another 90-minute shutdown between compatible runs. Use the abbreviated cycle where the product family allows it. Richard's name appeared above the message. I was discussing efficiency, he said. I did not instruct anyone to skip a safety requirement. Owen displayed the quality manager's reply, which warned that the pump connection and gasket required full disassembly after products containing peanuts. Below it sat Richard's response directing staff to verify the shorter process without delaying shipping. Grace looked at him. Did you know the quality department had not approved that process? I do not remember every technical email sent to me. You answered this one, Dana said. Dad turned toward her. My response relied on plant management to make the final decision. So, you directed them to keep the schedule moving, but now, say they alone carried the responsibility for how they did it, Dana replied. The company attorney objected to the wording, but Grace raised one hand. This is not a trial, she said. It is a credit decision. We need to know whether current ownership can be trusted to preserve records and operate the plant. Richard shifted to his second version. He was the founder, he said, not the daily operator. Lydia managed production targets, quality reports, and retailer releases. Paul supervised the floor. Elaine handled administrative records. Dad claimed he had received summaries, not details. Dana replaced the email with a capital request from Paul asking for separate equipment for controlled filling. Richard had denied it personally. Another document showed him approving the holiday schedule that left too little time for the full cleaning cycles. The records did not show a distant founder. They showed a man controlling cost, equipment, timing, and the language used when those choices failed. Richard stopped answering Dana and directed every response to Grace. Audrey has spent months assembling documents to make ordinary business decisions look criminal. I have not asked anyone in this room to call them criminal, I said. I asked for the records to be compared. His eyes met mine. The expression was familiar, the flat warning that once meant I had one chance to become quiet. This time, I wrote the time beside his statement and waited. Grace turned to Elaine. Mrs. Bennett, your administrative account was used to change sanitation entries. You also sent instructions concerning older files. Please explain. Mom drew a careful breath. The entries were corrected so they would be clear. We had handwritten logs, electronic records, draft forms, and final forms. My job was to make sure the official file did not contain duplicates that confused auditors. Who decided which version was official? Grace asked. The approved version was the one reviewed by management. Which management? Elaine glanced toward Richard. The people responsible at the time. Dana set Nora's carbon copy beside the version sent to the insurer after Jonah's reaction. The original time ended my shift before the fundraiser order left the bakery. The revised time placed me there afterward. These are not duplicates, Dana said. One time was added after the carbon separated from the top sheet. Mom's fingers found the tissue in her lap. That was 20 years ago. Nobody remembers every correction. Nora Reed remembers collecting the original copy, Dana said. Mrs. Collins confirms Audrey was at the community college. The Hale file contains the revised version. Elaine looked at me, not at Dana. Audrey had designed the system. She was responsible for teaching everyone. I was not in the building when Lydia moved the tray, I said. You knew your sister was young. You knew she needed supervision. I told her not to relabel anything. She repeated the instruction. Mom's voice softened, and I heard the old kitchen table in it. We were trying to save the bakery. Your father and I believed you were strong enough to recover. Lydia was 14. She would have been destroyed. No one interrupted her. Elaine seemed to hear the sentence only after it had reached the other side of the table. Grace leaned forward. Are you saying the records were changed because you believed Audrey could withstand the consequences better than Lydia? Mom's mouth opened, then closed. Richard spoke before she could answer. She is saying the family was under extreme pressure. Elaine's head turned toward him. You told me Audrey would get another scholarship. That is not relevant here. You said the insurer needed one responsible employee. The tissue tore between her fingers. Dad's voice dropped. Elaine, stop. For the first time in the meeting, my mother did not obey him. You said the bakery would close if we told them Lydia changed the tray. You said Audrey was 18 and could start somewhere else. The room remained still. Even Paul stopped rubbing his thumb along the edge of his folder. I had heard enough through the office door 20 years earlier to know why they chose me. Hearing Elaine repeat it before the bank, insurer, lawyers, and employee representative did not repair anything. It simply removed the last place where she could hide the decision inside words like confusion and correction. Dana moved to the current emails. Please make sure the legacy training records align with the version already provided to the insurer. Move them to archive and replace the index. Keep only the approved version in the audit folder. Mom looked at the screen. I was trying to keep old drafts from being mistaken for current procedures. The handwritten records showed what actually happened, Owen said. Removing them made the audit file less accurate. I did not destroy anything. You made it harder to find, Grace replied. Elaine turned toward me again. Audrey, tell them I never wanted anyone hurt. I am not here to tell them what you wanted, I said. I can only tell them what you did. Grace called a short recess before Lydia spoke. In the hallway, Marisol stood beside a vending machine with her arms folded. Your mother just admitted it, she said. She admitted why they chose me. Isn't that enough? Enough for what? Marisol considered the question. Not enough to keep them out of management, apparently. It helps. The current records matter more. She nodded toward the conference room. Workers are afraid the bank will shut the place before Friday. I know. Do you? The words were not hostile. They were a test. I know missing one payroll can become missed rent, canceled prescriptions, and a grocery bill put on a credit card, I said. I also know reopening under the same management would place those jobs at risk again. Marisol watched me for another moment. Then say both things when you present your plan. When the meeting resumed, Lydia asked to speak without Richard interrupting. Grace agreed. My sister began with the tray. I moved it when I was 14, Lydia said. The controlled order was short. I took a regular tray, changed the band, and used the allergen label. Audrey had already left for her presentation. Richard's chair creaked. Lydia continued. I told my parents that night. They changed the records and blamed Audrey. Elaine looked down. Dad stared toward the screen. Lydia then admitted finding the old due diligence memo 7 years earlier. She knew the shift times did not match the public story, yet allowed Bennett Harth to keep using interviews that blamed me. I benefited from it, she said. It gave the brand a recovery story, and I did not correct it. Evan placed copies of the sanitation warning and release authorizations on the table. As chief executive, I received the quality report, Lydia continued. I knew the shortened wash had not been validated for every changeover. Richard told me the risk was low, and the plant could not meet its contracts if we stopped the kettle. I signed the releases. Grace asked the question Lydia had avoided with me. Did your father force your signature? No. Could you have stopped shipment? Lydia's gaze stayed on the table. Yes. Richard reached for a folder beside his attorney. Since Lydia has chosen to describe events selectively, I have a statement addressing her authority. Evan looked toward him. Do not do this. Dad ignored the warning and slid the statement toward Grace. It said Lydia had independently reduced sanitation time, concealed quality warnings, and directed Elaine to adjust records after the recall. Richard claimed he learned the full scope only after outside testing began. Lydia stared at the pages. You signed it. I prepared an accurate statement. You wrote this before the emergency meeting was scheduled. Dana placed a verification report beside the draft. The file metadata showed that Richard's private attorney created the first version weeks earlier, before Lydia approached us, and before the bank called the meeting. Pencil edits on the paper copy matched a scanned version sent to the attorney's office. This was not prepared in response to anything Lydia said today, Dana explained. It was developed as a fallback position while Richard was still asking Audrey to sign the investment agreement. Grace looked from the draft to the Christmas contract. Dana walked through the two documents without raising her voice. If I signed, True Table would provide cash, accept operational burdens, lend its safety seal, and acknowledge a shared process history. Richard could describe later failures as problems arising during integration. If I refused, and the review continued, the prepared statement shifted responsibility to Lydia. Richard had planned both routes before Christmas dinner. Lydia's chair moved back several inches. You were going to do to me what you did to her. Dad's expression did not change. You made decisions I did not approve. You approved the schedule. You denied the equipment. You told me the warning was paperwork. You were chief executive. And Audrey was 18, Lydia said. That did not stop you then. Elaine whispered Richard's name, but he did not look at her. The family image did not break with shouting. It ended in the silence after Lydia's sentence. When all three of them understood that the others had brought documents for self-defense, Grace called the final portion of the meeting. The bank will not continue funding under current control, she said. We are prepared to consider a limited extension only if Bennett Harth accepts an independent restructuring officer with authority over cash, records, production, and any sale process. Richard's attorney asked for a private discussion. Grace refused. You may confer with your client, but the condition is not negotiable. The insurer's lawyer added that coverage remained under review. Any destruction, alteration, or withholding of records could affect what the policy paid. Existing claims would not disappear through a sale. Then Grace asked whether anyone had a workable operating proposal. Richard offered first. He would step back from daily production, he said, but remain chairman. Lydia could take a leave. Elaine would surrender administrative access. The Bennett name would remain, and the family would retain one board seat to protect its legacy. Marisol wrote something in her folder and pushed it toward me. Same control, different chairs. I placed my plan on the table. It did not ask the bank to award Bennett Harth to True Table. It did not ask creditors to forgive the old debts. And it did not promise that every position could be saved. The plant would enter a supervised restructuring or sale. An outside officer would control cash and records. Safety would report independently from production and have authority to stop a line without approval from ownership. Managers involved in false records or concealed warnings would be removed pending review. Existing claims would remain with the responsible entities according to law and insurance coverage. Clean assets could be sold through an open, independently valued process. True Table may submit a bid, I said. So may any qualified buyer. I remain recused from my company's decision. Grace asked about employment. Based on the current production volume and retailer interest, a buyer may be able to retain around 2/3 of the workforce, I replied. That is not guaranteed. Workers would be evaluated by conduct and role, not treated as responsible merely because they worked here. Marisol spoke next. Employees support keeping the plant open, but not under Richard, Elaine, Lydia, or any manager who changed records or ignored safety reports. Richard looked at her as though an appliance had spoken. My family created those jobs, he said. Workers created the product, Marisol replied. Your family signed the papers. Dad turned back to Grace. I will accept an outside officer if the Bennett Harth name remains and the family receives one non-voting honorary seat. I had expected him to bargain over money, the house, or his legal exposure. He bargained for the name. Grace looked toward me. Does the proposed buyer group require the name? True Table's committee has made no bid, I said. My position is that the Bennett Hearth name should not transfer with the operating assets. Richard leaned forward. You want to erase your own family. The name was used to sell a safety story built on altered records, stolen credit, and current warnings that were ignored. Keeping it would ask customers and workers to trust the same promise again. It is worth millions. Then the review can value it separately. I will not support using it on food. His eyes narrowed. You would destroy what 3 generations built because you were unhappy at 18. No, I said. I would preserve the equipment, contracts, and jobs that still have value. The name is the part you poisoned. The bank's collateral officer entered near the end of the meeting with an updated property schedule. Grace reviewed it, then asked Richard to confirm that the guarantees were complete. Elaine leaned toward the page. Why is our house listed? Dad did not answer. She pulled the schedule closer. The family home and the original bakery property had been pledged as additional security during the company's last credit extension. When did you do this? Elaine asked. It was necessary to maintain liquidity. You told me the house was protected. You signed the renewal package. I signed where you marked. Richard's attorney murmured that they should discuss it privately, but Elaine kept staring at the page. The man she had protected for 20 years had placed her home beneath the same debt without explaining what it meant. She had changed records for him, blamed one daughter, protected another, and believed loyalty would purchase safety. Richard had never sold safety. He sold time, and someone else always paid when it ran out. Grace announced the bank's decision shortly before 5. Bennett Hearth would receive a short operating extension, conditioned on immediate appointment of an independent restructuring officer. Richard, Elaine, and Lydia would surrender authority over cash, production records, personnel decisions, and negotiations with buyers. The officer would preserve the plant, assess payroll needs, and begin a supervised sale of usable assets. If the family refused, the bank would suspend funding and pursue its rights against the collateral. Richard asked for the night to consider. Grace gave him 1 hour. He signed before 6. By the time we stepped outside, rain had replaced the last dirty snow along the curb. Marisol stood beneath the bank awning and called the employee committee. Dana walked toward the parking garage with a signed control agreement tucked inside her case. Lydia left through another door with Evan. Elaine followed Richard to their car, but did not take his arm. At 9 that evening, the independent officer sent the first notice to Bennett Hearth staff. Production would continue on a reduced schedule while records and finances were reviewed. No member of the Bennett family retained operational authority. The company still existed. The name still hung over the factory entrance. But for the first morning in its history, Bennett Hearth would open without a Bennett in control. Before I went to bed, True Table's independent committee sent me one final message. The supervised sale had been approved, and our company was eligible to bid on the factory, equipment, and clean contracts. The brand name was listed as a separate asset. I had spent 20 years proving I could build something without it. Now I had to decide whether any part of that name deserved to survive. The supervised sale took most of the spring. Appraisers inspected the ovens, kettles, packaging lines, cold storage rooms, delivery vehicles, and every contract that might still have value. Lawyers separated usable assets from old claims. The bank reviewed bids while the insurer decided which losses it would cover and which ones had been created by false statements. True Table submitted an offer through the independent committee overseeing the transaction. I did not vote, negotiate the price, or attend meetings where competing bids were discussed. Every document came to me only after a decision had been made. That distance bothered me more than I expected. Bennett Hearth had been built from the bakery where I learned to weigh flour, read labels, and understand how easily one shortcut could harm a stranger. Now I had to trust other people to decide whether any part of it belonged inside the company I had spent 20 years building. In May, the committee approved the purchase. True Table acquired part of the factory, selected equipment, inventory that passed independent testing, and several retailer contracts that could continue under new controls. We did not buy the Bennett Hearth name. We did not assume responsibility for old claims beyond what the law and final purchase agreement required. Richard, Elaine, and Lydia received no management role, honorary title, consulting agreement, or right to enter the facility without permission. The price came from independent valuation, not from a private bargain arranged around a family dinner. About 2/3 of the workers were offered positions after their roles were reviewed. Some people had raised concerns and been ignored. Others had followed orders they should have questioned. A smaller group had changed records or signed forms they knew were false. We did not treat every employee as guilty because of the name on their paycheck, but we did not call pressure an excuse for everything. The transition fund came from the sale proceeds, available insurance money, and the creditor plan. I did not write a personal check to cover every debt Richard had created. Workers received wages during the handover, and health coverage continued while the new company decided which positions the plant could support. On the first morning of retraining, I stood in front of a room filled with production workers, maintenance staff, supervisors, and quality employees. Some had known me as Richard Bennett's estranged daughter. Others knew me only from Lydia's television interviews. "I cannot promise that this place will never make another mistake," I told them. "No honest company can promise that. What I can promise is that safety staff will have the authority to stop a line, even when an order is late and even when the person demanding speed has a larger office." Marisol sat in the front row with her notebook open. "There will be no private version of a record and no approved version that replaces what actually happened," I continued. "If a process is not safe, the answer is not to adjust the paperwork until it looks safe." A man from packaging raised his hand. "What happens if stopping the line costs the company a major customer?" "Then management explains the delay to the customer," I said. "The worker who reports the problem does not carry that cost alone." The new safety director reported to an independent committee, not to production. Cleaning records were linked to equipment sensors and still required human verification. Reworked ingredients could not enter controlled products without documented approval, matching allergen categories, and a verified sanitation history. Kettle number 3 remained in the building, but its pump assembly was replaced and its use restricted. The old abbreviation that had allowed people to treat R3 as an ordinary routing code was removed. By early June, the factory was ready to reopen. The old Bennett Hearth sign came down on a windy Tuesday morning. The letters were larger than they appeared from the road. A crew worked from a lift while employees watched through the front windows. The first metal B came loose with a sharp mechanical whine, tilted forward, and disappeared behind the lift rail. Richard stood across the parking lot beside his attorney. He had been allowed to collect several personal items under supervision, but the restructuring officer would not let him enter the production areas. His suit hung more loosely than it had at the bank meeting. He watched the workers remove his name as though they were dismantling part of the building. When the last letter came down, Dad crossed the marked visitor area and stopped several feet from me. "You could have kept it," he said. "The buyers did not want it. You made sure of that. The records made sure of it." His gaze moved toward the blank brick above the entrance. 3 generations of our family built this place. Workers built the products, customers paid for them, lenders financed the expansion. The name did not do any of that. It meant something. "It did," I said. "That is why it could not stay." Richard's mouth hardened. "You wanted to see me lose it. I wanted the factory to survive without asking anyone else to carry your lies. You are taking everything our family built." "No. I am keeping what the workers built. The rest belongs in the claims file." He looked at me for a long moment, waiting for anger he could call cruelty or grief he could use as proof that I still wanted his approval. I gave him neither. The new company name appeared above the entrance 2 days later. Clearline Foods. It did not include Bennett. It did not include Audrey. No family name stood above the safety rules everyone beneath it was expected to follow. The legal consequences arrived in pieces over the next several months. The insurer denied coverage for losses connected to records it found had been knowingly altered. Creditors pursued the assets Richard had pledged, including the original bakery property and the family house. A civil settlement required part of the remaining proceeds to fund customer claims, retailer losses, and restitution. State prosecutors filed charges tied to insurance fraud, falsified business records, and interference with the review. Richard surrendered through counsel rather than being arrested at the factory. By July, he had agreed to plead guilty to several counts in exchange for dismissal of others, subject to court approval and later sentencing. The agreement required restitution. and barred him from controlling a food company while the order remained in effect. Elaine's emails and the altered shift records prevented her from claiming she had only followed her husband. Her lawyers negotiated a separate resolution that included restitution, supervised probation, and a sworn correction of the statement blaming me for Jonah's reaction. She had to sign her name beneath words she had avoided for 20 years. Audrey Bennett did not authorize or perform the relabeling that caused the incident. Lydia's cooperation reduced some of the charges she might otherwise have faced, but it did not return what she had built on the lie. She surrendered bonuses linked to the false safety reports, lost every advertising agreement tied to Bennett Hearth, and accepted a multi-year restriction on holding management responsibility for food safety or quality control. No one hired her as the face of a family brand after that. The insurer added a supplemental determination to the old claim file. The Hale settlement was not erased, and Jonah's suffering was not rewritten as a misunderstanding. The new record stated that the original incident report contained altered work times and that I had not changed the label on the tray he ate from. The local newspaper published a correction based on the insurance findings, sworn statements, and civil records. Rachel did not pitch the story, and True Table did not place advertisements beside it. The correction was 6 paragraphs long. I printed one copy and placed it in a drawer. For years, I had imagined that seeing the truth in print would feel like getting my old life back. It did not. The scholarship remained lost. Mrs. Collins's sewing room had still been my home. Jonah had still spent years afraid of food he could not verify. The correction gave me something smaller and more useful. My family could no longer point to an official file and call their version the truth. Jonah did not speak to reporters. He kept the promise he had made in Dana's conference room and told the investigators everything, including the fact that I had known the old bakery sometimes ignored its own rules. After Clearline's new sign went up, he sent me one message. I saw the new name. You were right not to keep theirs. I read it twice before answering. This time, the rules belonged to everyone. Elaine called near the end of June. The house was being sold, and she had moved into a furnished apartment while her lawyer reviewed what money would remain after the secured debts. She asked whether she could visit me at Christmas. Then she asked whether she could stay for a few weeks until she found something permanent. I sent her contact information for a housing counselor, a financial advisor, and an attorney who did not represent Richard. I did not give her my address. You have room, she said over the phone. This is not about room. I am still your mother. And I am still the daughter you chose because you thought I could survive being sacrificed. Elaine began to cry quietly. I waited without filling the silence for her. Will you ever forgive me? She asked. I do not know, I said. But forgiveness would not make living together safe. Lydia contacted me through Evan a week later. She offered to advise Clearline on retailer relationships and brand strategy. According to her proposal, no one understood Bennett Hearth's customers better than she did. I declined. Knowing how to sell trust was not the same as deserving authority over it. By July, 6 months had passed since the Christmas dinner. That was when I stood inside Clearline's training room and watched a young quality technician attach a blue silicone band to an approved rack. The original rack from the old bakery stood behind glass near the entrance. Its metal had dulled, and the first blue band had faded almost gray. We kept it there without the Bennett logo, and without my name printed beneath it. The technician pointed toward the display. Why keep something from the old company after everything that happened? I ran one finger along the edge of the glass. Because the rule was never the problem, I said. Safety begins the moment someone refuses to call a lie a family secret. When your family asks you to carry the consequences of choices you did not make, you must pause before calling that sacrifice love. Read every document, protect your name, and never let guilt rush you into signing away your money or future. You can care about workers without rescuing the people who harmed them. You can forgive without restoring access, trust, or authority. Most importantly, admit your own mistakes, correct them, and let independent facts guide your step. A wise decision does not protect everyone from consequences. It puts responsibility back where it belongs and stops the harm from repeating.